All right, everybody, welcome to the show. I'm Scott Horton, and this is the Future Freedom. I'm here every Thursday, well, except when I'm not, but usually I'm here every Thursday to interview Jacob Hornberger, the founder and the president of the Future of Freedom Foundation here on Liberty.me. Hey, Jacob, how are you doing?
Doing great, Scott. Great to be back with you again.
Very good to have you here. I got a bunch of things to ask you and all kinds of things, but I better tell the chat room guys to refresh the page here.
Okay.
So that somebody's watching us. Okay, y'all, refresh here. We're on. It's the show. All right, so tons to talk about, Jacob Hornberger. But most importantly, I'm not sure if you saw the Onion headline or not, that they held a gala at the White House for the 25-year anniversary of the beginning of the bombing of Iraq, which they've kept up all this time. As they know, it's actually a very well done article. They note in there that there were about 2 years in 2012 and 13 when America was not bombing Iraq, but thank God that's over, and now we're right back again. And then so they had Colin Powell and Dick Cheney and Bill Clinton and Obama and Hillary Clinton and everybody, and they're all having a big party talking about how much fun they've had bombing Fallujah over and over and over again. And I was thinking, you know, I interviewed Barry Lando on my radio show, who wrote the book, was it A Web of Deceit, about the entire history of America bombing Iraq, going back to the Kennedy years, actually. But he's really good on the first Gulf War. And I have a question for you, because I know you've been at this libertarian game a long, long time. And I know that, well, for example, there's footage of Sheldon Richman being really good on the first Gulf War way back in 1990 in an event that he did with Pat Buchanan and a couple of others that was called Americans Against Genocide in the Gulf, something like that. So my question for you is, I'm just going to assume you were great on the first Gulf War, but I just wonder whether it was because, you know, I was in ninth grade or whatever. I was for it just because I like explosions and I was a stupid kid. So I get a pass on that. But I knew that the Republicans were evil and corrupt and dishonest. And so I just wonder, for somebody like you, was it as obvious to you then back in 1990, 91 as it was to you in 2003 that, holy crap, these Republicans are some sick, evil, nationalist, imperialists lying us into unnecessary war that's going to have all these terrible consequences and all of this stuff? Or did it seem plausible to you that, like, yeah, America's got to go and keep the world free now and keep the Japanese down, or whatever was the narrative at the time? Or just take us back to 1990, 91 for you, Jacob. What was it like?
Yeah, it really was obvious to us, and it was obvious to most libertarians. In fact, that was the war against Iraq that was kind of respectable for libertarians to take a stand against. That nobody worried about losing donations and so forth. It was going to be a small little intervention, relatively speaking. We were certain that there were going to be very few U.S. troops lost. There were going to be a lot of Iraqis lost, but nobody cared about them, well, except libertarians. But let me take you back even a step further from there. What had happened was that we had all grown up under the war on communism, the Cold War, the same way that kids today are brought up under the war on terrorism. And so, you know, we had this constant blast at us for year after year after year that the communist threat, the communists are coming to get us. And of course, there was the Vietnam War to stop the communist dominoes from dropping. And they were deadly serious about this, that we really faced a dagger 90 miles away from American shores. So this is the way we all grew up, you know, that the communist threat. Well, lo and behold, and nobody thought the communist threat, the Cold War, was ever going to end. I remember libertarians discussing this in the 80s, where they said that the Soviet Union will never fall apart voluntarily. They have all the guns. There's no way a revolution would prevail. We had seen what had happened in Hungary in, I think, 56 or so. And so the thought of the Soviet Union falling apart and them losing this official enemy was just out of the question. And the conservatives always took the position that, look, we're against big government, but as long as we have the communist threat and the Soviet threat, we don't have a choice. And the implication being that if we ever lost the Soviet Union as an official enemy, we could dismantle the big standing army, the CIA, the Pentagon, and so forth. Well, all of a sudden in 1989, it happens, to everybody's shock. I mean, it's impossible to overstate what a shock this whole thing was, that all of a sudden the Cold War was really over. What we'd all lived under, nuclear warfare, the threat of nuclear warfare and fallout shelters and stuff, it was over. And I remember this, 90 was when I was starting the Future of Freedom Foundation. And most of our focus was on domestic policy, the welfare state, the managed economy, and so forth. But some of it was focused on foreign affairs. We were battling against foreign interventionism, like in Panama and other countries. But everybody was talking about a peace dividend. And what they meant by that was that, hey, we can start at the very minimum downsizing the military, that the Cold War is over. So it's like any war is over, let's start downsizing. And that was being spoken of commonly, mainstream media, everything, the peace dividend. The Pentagon was nervous as they could be. And they were coming out with statements like, look, don't do anything drastic here. We still can play an important role here, even though the Cold War is over. They were lost and they were panicky. And they said, we can fight the drug war. We can help American businesses open up markets overseas. I mean, they were coming up with all these ideas. Well, lo and behold, the man who had previously been their partner in the 1980s, Saddam Hussein, gives them the greatest gift that could ever be given the national security state at this point, when people are talking about this dividend. He goes in and they have this fight with Kuwait, the Iraqis, over slant drilling. He claimed that the Kuwaitis were drilling oil wells that were slanting under Iraq land, and Kuwait was denying it. And so finally, to resolve it, the natural way is after they couldn't work things out, Iraq invades Kuwait. And there's some suspicious there stuff too, because April Glaspie, the U.S. ambassador, when Saddam asked her, how would you feel if something like this happened, she kind of gave this innocuous answer like, this is none of our business. Well, as soon as Iraq invades, it became the business of the U.S. government. And now all of a sudden, this is the new Hitler, that this is horrendous, that this is like the new threat. Saddam Hussein is going to conquer the world. I mean, we're talking about a third world country. But this became the enormous threat. Now the Pentagon and the CIA were back in business, that this is the new threat to America and to the world.
But wait, so for people like yourself who, I mean, I'm not trying to sell you short, but I'm just saying, for anyone who didn't buy this whole USA, we're number one, yellow ribbon thing campaign at the time, it was another one of these, oh, here we go, eye rolling, oh my God, look at them kind of a thing from your point of view at the time. It was that obvious, that cynical of an exploitation by the Pentagon, and that obvious to yourself and your colleagues at the time as well.
Absolutely. I was working closely with Richard Ebeling, who now teaches economics at the Citadel, and he was the vice president of academic affairs for FFF. And since there was a time delay in getting our articles in our monthly journal, Freedom Daily, I mean, it was like a 2 or 3 month time delay from the time we wrote them till the time they got published. We started issuing separate monographs that we called from the president's desk and from the vice president's desk, that we were sending out to our subscribers right at the moment, and to let them know where we stood. And among these was this fierce, ardent opposition against interventionism in the Persian Gulf War. And we were making all the standard arguments against foreign interventionism, where it leads to, that this is not the right direction for America. But we were facing an uphill battle because the mainstream media was saying this is aggression, this is clear-cut aggression. If we don't draw the line now, it'll be appeasement. It was all the standard stuff that
like Kuwait was a state in the Union that they're bound to defend. Our Constitution, binds us to defend every monarchy on this planet. Everybody knows that.
Yeah, and they were calling it a fight for freedom. That's what was really fascinating. I mean, the thought that people in Kuwait are free is ridiculous. I mean, you couldn't. I mean, it'd be difficult to find a better example of people that are not free. But you see, these borders were sacrosanct, and I remember Richard really had a good grasp of the history of this thing, and Richard was pointing out that these are artificial lines that the British drew. There's nothing sacred about these borders and lines and stuff. So here, America was going to war to preserve borders that had been established by the British Empire, and in defense of this monarchy. Well, we took a very principled stand, and so did, I think, all the libertarian organizations. That, like I say, this was sort of a respectable one, totally unlike 9/11. 9/11 was really the game changer.
Let's get to that in a minute, but
yeah.
As far as the first Gulf War, as a ninth grader at the time, and one who was very interested in paying attention, I watched a lot of CNN and what have you, and I have to tell you, I never even found out that there was any opposition to that war organized in any sense until maybe a year after it was over. Someone told me, was talking about it and said, and I asked, and they said, you mean you never saw the protest down at the Capitol building on the local news at all or anything? The Democrats were down. I'm in Austin, Berkeley on the Colorado, for Christ's sake. The Democrats, and not just the very liberal, very progressive or what ideological, but the Democrats, because it was the Republicans doing it. So it was, perfectly safe politically for them. They had huge protests down there. No blood for oil, they chanted. And I wasn't even exposed to that fact once. And I was paying attention. I really cared. Never mind libertarians. Never mind free market capitalists saying republic, not empire. I wasn't even exposed to the fact that anyone in America had a case to make against that war other than, I don't know, maybe it's, maybe we don't have to fight for Kuwait because who cares or something, but certainly no organized case whatsoever, not even among patchouli stinking hippies, of which there were thousands and thousands and thousands who were against the war. The only opposition that entire war that I heard of was my parents going, man, I don't know, don't really like the Bushes, and a hippie girl at my school who would walk around stinking like patchouli and singing "Give Peace a Chance," which is, of course, almost perfect what the media would have us believe. Anyone who is anti-war is that, right? They don't know anything. They just have a little song and leave responsible things to responsible people. But I got to tell you, and I'll never get over that. And that may be a big part of why I'm such an anti-war activist now, is because it's not just that it was an unfair fight. It was that I never heard that there was an anti-war movement that existed in 1990, 1991 until 1992.
Well, the thing that was interesting about the libertarian part of this thing is that we had written some articles, published some articles against foreign interventionism, but they were considered kind of like esoteric. That was history. It didn't really matter, like the Spanish-American War, the turn toward empire, because everything was the Cold War, and so this was what was holding up the huge apparatus of the national security establishment. So when we start addressing foreign interventionism in 1991, after the invasion of Kuwait, this was a shock to a lot of libertarians, because what had previously been kind of esoteric, was now real. A lot of libertarians still had that conservative orientation. And so they looked at it like, this is aggression. Somebody's got to stop the aggression. And so when we were making these arguments, it was really novel to a lot of libertarians. For once, it was real to them, and they really didn't know what to make of it. Because let's face it, this intellectual paradigm of libertarianism on foreign policy has not been really well developed. I mean, it has been in the last 25 years now. But at that time, it was difficult to find works that were arguing against interventionism and stuff, because everything was pretty much oriented toward the Cold War.
Right. So there was Noam Chomsky, and then that was about it, basically, and that was, of course, pre-internet days. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's really right. That was something I was going to try to sort of get to, but didn't know really how to articulate it or whatever, right? But that's really it. At the end of the Cold War, when these guys, when the national security state came up with all their busy work, there was no real kind of coherent argument against them, except maybe from a Chomsky type. And obviously you guys screaming in the wind from, your tiny perch at the FFF or whatever, but there wasn't much of, well, there was nothing left of the old right, I guess is what I'm trying to say. There was no one to say, hey, except for Pat, right? It was Pat Buchanan and one very small handful of paleo conservatives who said, now that the Cold War is over, we should not go to war in the Middle East. But again, I was paying close attention. I was watching CNN and Pat Buchanan was on CNN, and I still didn't know that anybody was against that war. Certainly, I didn't know that there were right-wingers who were against that war. I mean, that would have been mind-blowing if they had really given Pat a hearing in 91 for a lot of people, because he is the kind of the essence of, Reagan Republicanism, right? So for him to oppose the war, either he's gone crazy or the rest of us have, but let's stop and figure out what's going on here,
Oh, yeah. No, my recollection was that this was a very popular war, that he got the coalition, a huge coalition with, 30 or 40 countries or so, and mounted it all up and told Saddam, get out. And Saddam said, to heck with you. And this was clear-cut aggression. But it's good that you started this segment with this thing about the Onion, because as humorous as it is in a tragic sort of way, it really was the start of 25 years of killing people that really the U.S. had no right to kill. And it was the start of everything. I mean, because in the midst of they're massacring untold numbers of Iraqis. Now, they may be soldiers, but they're Iraqis that have families. These are families that, grieve when their loved ones get killed. And I'm telling you, it was a total massacre. In fact, they finally stopped shooting the Iraqi troops fleeing on the highway from Kuwait back to Baghdad, because people were really saying this is just a sheer massacre. It's horrible. And then in the middle of this thing, they decide to destroy the water and sewage facilities in Iraq. And they had done a study first as to what would happen. And they said, well, you're going to have a lot of spread of infectious illnesses, diseases, and stuff if you do this. Clearly a war crime. And the Pentagon said, do it. And so they did it, knowing that this was their goal. Well, and then after that, they imposed the sanctions. Well, the sanctions specifically prevented them from restoring and fixing these water and sewage facilities. That then led directly to the deaths of the Iraqi children, which led to Madeleine Albright's infamous statement that the deaths of 500,000 of these children was worth it. So the people in the Middle East were watching these children die year after year. 2 high UN officials resigned out of protest against what they called genocide. And I'm willing to bet that very few Americans knew what was going on here. But the anger that was building up, it was boiling. When that guy, Ramzi Youssef, comes over and sets off the bomb in the World Trade Center in 93, they catch him in 95 in Pakistan. They bring him back to the United States. They put him on trial. They prosecute him. Terrorism is a criminal offense under U.S. law. He's in federal court at his sentencing. He calls the U.S. butchers, and he says the best example of your butchery is what you're doing to these Iraqi children. Well, all of this, Scott, stems from that Persian Gulf War, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And throughout the 90s, all the conservatives, this wasn't just a neocon thing. The conservatives were screaming, get Saddam. Saddam's a threat. I mean, he was the ISIS of the 1990s. He was the Soviet Union of the 1990s, the Hitler of the 90s. And I remember people were obsessed with it. And they were saying, why didn't George W. Bush go all the way to Baghdad? If only he had done that, Saddam wouldn't be a threat to us today. Well, he never was a threat to us. But it was fascinating how propaganda could do that. And of course, you know where it came out after that 9/11 hits because of that anger that had been building up over 11 years. They retaliate, and they had retaliated before with the 93 attack and the attacks on the USS Cole. And then that's when it gave George H.W. Bush the opportunity to remedy what his father had not done, and that was invade Iraq to go get Saddam Hussein.
Yeah. Programming note: we got to switch the middle initials around there. HW is senior and W is junior. But anyway,
oh, right.
Sorry, but just to be clear.
No, good job.
Yeah. But anyway, so yeah, no, you're totally right. I mean, and that's the whole thing about it is here H.W. Bush promised this will not be another Vietnam. I swear it's going to be great. We're going to go in there. We're going to kick their ass. We're going to call it short. We got, I could play the clip. I have it of Dick Cheney in 94 explaining why it would have been a horrible mistake to go all the way to Baghdad, because the Iranians would get the South. The Kurds might break off, and that could cause a war with the Turks, our allies. And you'd have an independent Sunni stand in the West, maybe break off with Syria, and then America be occupying Baghdad, looking for Saddam, getting shot at in urban warfare. And how many American lives is this guy worth? We figured not that many, and so let's not do it. It's a perfect explanation of why not to do what then they turn around and did later. But yeah, I mean, to think about, especially for young people now, I mean, I forget how far in the future we are. Here in 2016, to look back on this after 25 years, just think about this like, a student looking at this and compare, just look at a globe or look at an old map of here was the USSR, okay? And now here's Iraq. And now this is our substitute for that. Now that that's gone, we're going to go ahead and this guy Hussein, who after 91, all he controlled was Baghdad, Tikrit, Fallujah, Mosul, right? He didn't control Kurdistan at all. And he had a no-fly, no-drive zone in Kurdistan. It was completely autonomous under American protection. No-fly zone in the south. So he had, obviously some political control in the south, but not completely. I mean, he basically was the ruler of just a rump state at the time of the invasion anyway. And this was the threat, like you say, that they used to enhance the power of the U.S. state and the United Nations all through the 1990s, used him as the whipping boy. And this is where I get to blaming the American people, where, it was their responsibility. They chose to believe that this is peacetime and everything is just Homer Simpson and Crystal Pepsi and Jerry Seinfeld and everything is just fine, while their government is murdering the hell out of these people, as you say, by the hundreds and hundreds of thousands, creating terrorist enemies against the United States, and nobody cared. The only people who cared were the people who wanted to go to war against Saddam, as you say, the little cottage industry of Laurie Milroy and Saddam Hussein's unfinished war against us, and talk radio and whatever, warmongering, setting us up for the second invasion. And who stopped them out of, at the time, almost 300 million Americans, who was organized to try to put a halt to the Project for a New American Century and their obvious publicly stated plans? Virtually no one.
No, and there's an interesting side story too of the Persian Gulf War at the end of it, that George H.W. Bush incites the Shiites to rise up in revolt. And this is a dangerous thing when you revolt against a dictator, even a dictator that's wounded because the U.S. forces had knocked out a lot of Iraqi soldiers. So Bush thinks, okay, well, we won't risk American lives here, but we'll get these Shiites, which were the same group, the same religious sect, that they end up installing in his son's invasion. So he gets them to revolt, and he implicitly leads them to believe that we're behind you, that you get this revolt going, and at least they believed that the U.S. was going to come to their assistance. And Saddam Hussein's forces, despite the fact that they had been clearly clipped by U.S. forces, were still strong enough, and they brutally suppressed this Shiite rebellion. And of course, the U.S. forces just stayed back and watched them. They just watched this massacre after inciting them to do this. So you've got people all through Iraq after this in 1991 or stuff that are very angry at the United States. And then when you start killing these children, when the government starts killing these children, the cauldron is just boiling. I mean, if you read Ramzi Youssef's statement at his sentencing hearing, you will see total rage there. I mean, anger. Like what's going on.
It was that suppression, that the great Bay of Pigs of the desert of 91, where we set them up and stab them in the back. That then became the excuse for the no-fly zones, which were, of course, based out of the Arabian Peninsula. So it wasn't just the blockade, but it was daily air missions out of the Arabian Peninsula to go bomb Iraqis.
That's a great point.
Yeah, the New York Times said it was every other day on average that Bill Clinton bombed Iraq. You know, it was always a radar installation, right? They had so many radar installations in Iraq. Bill Clinton could bomb them every other day for 8 years and never get rid of them all. And also not lose a single plane either.
Well, and it's important that it's not just radar installations, but there are people at those radar installations. He's killing people. And I remember one time where they had an Iran missile go astray, and it lands in a field where they killed a teenage guy that was just tilling his crops. And so there's a lot of anger here because, as you pointed out at the very beginning, they have been killing people on a constant basis. And it's really interesting that you brought that up because I was thinking about it today. I said, my gosh, they have been killing people for all these years continuously in Iraq, the Middle East. I mean, it just boggles the mind how many people they've killed, and they're still killing them. I mean, and now you've got these presidential candidates all across the board that are competing against each other to see who's going to get to kill more people over there. It really is an incredible thing that's gone on with this whole national security state and the U.S. government generally. It's absolutely phenomenal. And one thing to keep in mind here, Scott, Iraq has never attacked the United States. They've never initiated terrorist attacks on the United States. Or threatened to. I mean, this is a country that has really just said, leave us alone. And the U.S. would not leave them alone. And instead, they've killed untold numbers of people. They've destroyed the whole country. And now you see the same process in Syria. You saw it with Libya. You saw it with Lebanon. I mean, it's just really how anybody can really defend foreign interventionism and foreign empire at this point. I don't get it. I really just don't get it.
Well, and you know, you think about it from the Iraqis' point of view too, especially with the second invasion and the real complete obliteration of that society. Imagine if that had happened to us. Some more powerful country came and kicked America over and set it on fire the way we did to Iraq. And they all did it in the name of an attack that some other group that had nothing to do with America whatsoever had perpetrated on them, right? Some group of Spanish commies attack the French, and then the French attack America, you know, and we're not even involved. And you think about that from the point of view of the average Fallujah or the average, you know, citizen of Mosul, assuming they've even heard of September 11th. And they go, wait, my only connection to that is that Egyptians and Saudis were avenging me for the crimes you were already committing against me before. And so now as punishment, you're going to invade me again. It's just, you think about, it's not just the mass murder of it, but the unfairness of it. You know what I mean? It's like, I read about the people of Dresden, the ones who survived. They sort of didn't take it that personally because they weren't really that invested in the Nazi regime. And they pretty much half blamed the Nazis and half blamed the British for burning their city down. You know what I mean? They could understand why it was the Brits and the Americans were coming for at least for what it was. But to be the Iraqis here, where they're wholly innocent victims in this entire project, again, 25 years. Was that your silver anniversary or something? 25 years of bombing people to death. And you know, let's go ahead and count Ronald Reagan got 500,000 Iraqis killed by financing and arming both sides of the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s. So there's 500,000. There's another, you know, probably million during the Clinton years. They say 500,000 children and 500,000 others during the decade of the blockade and the sanctions. Then you have another million killed during the Bush years. And then just with, you know, the constant state of warfare and deprivation and everything that's gone on, the complete inability of the society to rebuild after Iraq War II. And now they're in the midst of Iraq War III. I don't know how many have died since, you know, Obama took office in 2009 and picked this thing up. But we're working on 3 million dead Iraqis with at least the full complicity of the United States of America here. And again, as you said, a country has nothing to do with us whatsoever. A country that might as well be stuck between Senegal and Uganda somewhere that we never even heard of for all it has to do with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also important to remember that this is a country that had a relatively high standard of living. I mean, it's a dictatorial regime, an authoritarian regime, But there's a lot of those regimes all over the world, and people manage their lives. They figure out ways to survive and prosper. And that's the way it was in Iraq. There was a lot of relative prosperity, and certainly not like the United States, but in terms of standard of living in that part of the world, it was a high standard of living. Their educational standards were high. Again, I'm not defending their socialist type system, but it was a fairly good way of life in terms of standard of living. And the U.S. went in there and destroyed the entire country.
Yeah. Well, and protection of ethnic and religious minorities and of women too. I mean, that's the one good thing, probably the one only good thing about Marxism is the emphasis on equal rights between genders. And that was something that they had quite a bit of in Iraqi society. You know, women could wear blue jeans to teach college, for crying out loud. As you know, people, Americans picture Afghanistan and burqas and the town of Bedrock or whatever, but Iraq was not like that at all.
Well, the other thing that shocked me is that there's a lot of people that own guns in Iraq.
Yeah, everybody had an AK-47. You're allowed to.
Yeah, and that was under Saddam. I mean, he wasn't scared that they were going to overthrow his regime.
They got freedom and gun control now, Jacob.
Huh?
They got freedom and gun control now.
Exactly. The U.S. goes in there and confiscates everybody's guns, makes it illegal to own guns.
Whole thing's crazy. Hey, wait. So I want to ask you about something else that you wrote, which obviously dovetails with this whole thing here, which is about Islam. And of course, you know, almost no one other than Ron Paul on the national level, virtually no one will be honest enough to admit that the 20th century existed and that there were any, you know, precursors or any antecedents, any backstory or narrative that you could possibly need to know about the run up to September 11th. It, you know, they started it. And people, even when Glenn Greenwald writes an article where he points out that our own government admits that our foreign policies caused terrorism, he still never goes back to the 90s. He never goes back and says, and that was true for before 9/11 too, not just we blew it the way we responded, but we blew it the way we responded to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, damn it, that kind of thing. But so now here we are in 2016, and even though George Bush said, well, they don't hate us because they're Muslim. Islam is great, and this is a small faction, don't blame all Muslims. He did lie and say they hate us because we're free. And he never gave any explanation for why they might hate freedom other than they believe in Islam. So we're right back again where the entire right half of American society, you know, political society, believes that once you commit or have a certain level or depth of belief in Islam, you go to war against innocent white North American Christians. That's it. How dare they be free? How dare they be good? And we will put an end to them. And after all, they kind of play the part with ISIS dressing up in black and cutting off people's heads and doing all that stuff like in a CIA script. So what is the real truth about it, man? Maybe Islam is out to get us and I'm just Pollyanna, Jacob.
I really think that this whole Islam-Muslim thing is a way for people to avoid having to confront the evil of their own national security state. That the military is their God, the CIA is their God, and to acknowledge that they don't hate us for our freedom and values, or to acknowledge that it's not a religious problem, that means you've now got to start looking at what the U.S. national security state did over there to engender all this anger. And that's just something that people psychologically cannot do. This is their God. Now, if you go back to the Cold War that we were talking about, no one talked about the Muslim threat. Nobody talked about the Quran. Nobody talked about how Islam was going to come and get us. Everything was communism, communism, communism. In fact, when the U.S. government started partnering with extremist Muslims in Afghanistan, when it was the Soviet Union rather than the U.S. doing the occupying, Americans loved it. Yes, this is fantastic that the U.S. is partnering with extremist Muslims, and don't worry about the outcome. And so now, oh yeah, it's all the Muslim thing, because they don't want to confront that this is what the U.S. government was doing over there to get people angry. But Chalmers Johnson was writing about this before 9/11. He kept saying that if you keep doing this over here, we're going to see a major terrorist attack on American soil. We were writing it. Sheldon Richman wrote at least one op-ed, I think 2 op-eds, saying it's coming if you don't stop the sanctions and the rest of them. I alluded to this. And so when 9/11 happened, we weren't surprised. I mean, we knew that something big was coming. We thought it was going to come on 2000. But it was a no-brainer. But that's when the freedom and values thing came up. They couldn't say, well, they came and retaliated against what we've been doing. They played the innocent. They play, oh, we haven't done anything. And the standard American, he didn't know about the sanctions. He didn't know about the no-fly zones. He didn't know about the massacres during the Persian Gulf War. He didn't know that people were boiling with anger and rage over all this. And so he buys into the freedom and values thing, and ultimately that morphs into, oh, the Muslims are coming to get us. It's Islam's the problem. It's all a way to avoid confronting their God, the God of the national security state.
Okay, but you and me got a real problem here, because this whole hatred and irrational and ignorant fear of Islam and Muslims, including 3 to 5 million Americans, is spreading like wildfire, and it's getting dumber and apparently, more and more widely held all the time. And I mean, I'm like you. I don't ever stop talking about Ramzi Youssef said what this was about, dummies. But what else can we do, Jacob? Something's got to be done, because, there's just not enough of them. There are enough. If you get a small percentage of right-wing American white idiots to believe this stuff, you've already outnumbered the actual number of Muslims in the country. You know what I mean? It doesn't take much for this to be a real problem. And I'm just not sure, how willing other non-Muslims are to stick up for them. It doesn't seem like there are many people who are willing to really confront this.
Well, let me tell you something, man. There's nothing more powerful than truth. It'll cut through all this thing like a knife through butter. And let me tell you, this is your best proof that they know that their argument is bunk. If this was really a fight against Islam, they would be out there killing Muslim Americans. I mean, let's just assume that it really was a real war, a religious war. Wouldn't you go out and start killing the enemy? I mean, that's what war is about. And you've got all this enemy in our midst, all these Muslim
at least
Americans.
Notice them trying to kill you anyway.
Right.
Yep.
Now, notice that no American that takes this Islam position is going out killing Muslim Americans. And that shows you that deep down, they themselves don't believe this. And they know what will happen to them if they do that. They will be indicted in state criminal court, and they will be sent to jail for murder under the state murder statutes. And when they get before a judge and they say, no, Your Honor, we're at war, I just was killing the enemy, the judge is going to laugh as he sends him to the penitentiary. So that's like prima facie proof that they know they're living a lie. Here's the second point. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. invasions installed 2 official Islamic regimes. It's in their constitution. I mean, you go online and Google Constitution Iraq and Afghanistan, it'll say this is an official Islamic regime. Throughout all this time, the people that say the Muslims are the problem, they were supporting the U.S. troops. They were praising the troops. They were glorifying the troops. They were thanking the troops for their service. They still do that, for their service in Iraq and service in Afghanistan. If they really believe this Muslim Islam crud, why would they be praising troops that have installed 2 major Islamic regimes in 2 major countries?
Hey, I'm with you. And you know what? I was about to say we better go because we're over time here. But then David in the chat room says, this is good. Looking at things I haven't thought of or knew. So now I'm thinking, man, what else should we tell this guy now that we've got his ear here, Jacob? What can we get him to understand about this thing? I guess I would go back to Bill Clinton and the Bill Clinton years, and how Osama himself in 1996 and 1998 put out 2 fatwas, and he did multiple interviews with CNN and ABC News, and he said exactly what all of this was about. And he didn't just say why he was doing it. He said what he expected to happen. I'm going to hit you hard enough that you will invade Afghanistan, and then we will bleed you to bankruptcy and bog you down and destroy your empire just like we did to the Soviet Union. So there. Just like America wanted, in their own words, what they said, Brzezinski said, we want to give the Soviets their own Vietnam in Afghanistan. Osama said, we're going to give you your own Vietnam again in Afghanistan. And that was exactly why they did the September 11th attack. And then, and as you said, the first World Trade Center attack, the Khobar Towers, the Africa embassies, the USS Cole, and then September 11th. They're trying to bait us into going over there and running up a $20 trillion debt and breaking our military and breaking the American people's will to be a foreign empire over there at all. And of course, you know, so Jacob and I are just recommending the shortcut, which is just quit being an empire because you're not supposed to be one in the first place. And then you don't have to be bled to bankruptcy first. So.
Yeah, but the other thing you got to consider here, and that is that this has been the greatest thing that could ever happen to the national security establishment. Remember, this is an apparatus that was attached onto our federal governmental system, big standing army, what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, the CIA, the NSA. It was all attached to our federal governmental system, the original constitutional system, and the justification was the Cold War. And it fundamentally altered our governmental system. It converted it into a national security state. And so remember what I said earlier, that when the Cold War ended, these guys were panicky because the logical consequence of this is, well, if your justification for existence was the Cold War is over, we can now dismantle you. And so they were panicking. This whole thing of the interventionism in the Middle East culminating in the 9/11 attacks was the greatest thing that ever happened to the national security establishment. They are more powerful than ever. Their budgets are soaring. Okay, their troops are tired, they're worn out. But in terms of the elites, the defense contractors, the subcontractors, the whole machinery that probably would have been significantly downsized had there not been this blowback, as Chalmers Johnson called it, they would have been out of business here. I mean, this is the greatest thing. Look at the power they have now. The power, the official power to assassinate Americans, arrest us, put us into concentration camps, no trial by jury. I mean, these are extraordinary emergency powers. And notice that it's still an emergency. That 25 years ago, or I guess 9/11, when they declared an emergency, you know, it's still here 15 years later. So in terms of benefits, this has been the greatest racket that the U.S. national security state could have ever done. Now, did they go into the Middle East knowing that this was going to happen? Well, I don't know. But I wouldn't put it past some very smart guys that said, you know, what happens when we provoke hornets' nests? Well, this is what happens when we provoke hornets' nests. The hornets come back, get angry, full of rage, and sting. And then, of course, that benefits the national security state.
Yep, there you go. I mean, that's the whole thing about government economics, whether we're talking about, you know, the military invading the Middle East and Africa, or whether you're talking about the welfare state or whatever it is, that we're just talking about this on the show today, that counterproductive and productive are the same thing when you're talking about government. Right? Nothing wrong with failing. It's just like flammable and inflammable. They're synonyms.
It's really true, Scott, because look at the disaster they've produced, and all they say is, we're more important than ever. We have to go over there and kill ISIS now, and we have to kill more people over there. We got to get rid of Assad. I mean, failure produces success for them because it necessitates more interventionism. It's absolutely a fascinating mindset and paradigm, and why American voters continue supporting this thing. It just boggles my mind. I mean, it's really a success story for public schools, too. If you want to do a little digression here, I mean, this is the public school's greatest success story, where people fall for this racket despite its manifest failure and destructiveness. And as you point out of control spending and debt that's bankrupting our nation, and everybody just keeps sitting there and saying, praise the troops, keep it up, keep it up. I mean, it really is amazing.
Yep, it is. All right, well, listen, we better stop here and get back to campaign 2016, where everything is perfectly reasonable and acceptable. But we'll be back here next Thursday. Possibly we will begin on time at 8 p.m. Eastern here next Thursday for the Future of Freedom. Thanks, Jacob. Appreciate it, man.
Thank you, Scott. Enjoyed the show. See you next week.